Hey guys, welcome to this new masterclass of Mystica Boutique and Mystica Ultima. In this particular case, we're going to talk about color management in Mystica. First of all, this masterclass is not some kind of explanation of how you have to do your job. In this particular case, we're going to talk about some recommendations, some tips, some explanation of how Mystica works, but it's not mandatory to use these tips for your workflows. As you will probably know, in Mystica, you have always several ways to do the same job. So in this particular case, we're going to offer like some solutions, some examples of how we can manage the color of our projects. But if you already have a project, a color management workflow that it works in your projects or in your deliverables, then it's fine. You can still use that workflow, because at the end, what it really matters is that everything is right for your client or for the final delivery. So in this particular case, we're going to just offer some examples and some solutions of how can we use Mystica for managing the color in any kind of project. This list that you can see here in this snapshot is basically the list of topics that we are going to cover in this masterclass. As you can see, it's a fairly large list, but many of those points are really simple, are really easy to explain and really fast. So we won't stay too much time in some of those points. In fact, we're going to start with the basics, talking about the color management with the raw formats, which I know that probably most of you or many of you already know it, how to work with these kind of files. But just for starting from the scratch, I will start from that point, and then I will go to a more advanced workflows covering standard industry workflows like Dolby Vision, HDR, SDR, and using some specific tools in Mystica for managing those workflows like display filters, etc. All right, so I'm going to go back to my timeline. So we are going to start from here. I'm going to leave this list over there, just in case I need to take a look and see that we cover everything. But okay, I think we can start with these shots that I have in here. As you can see, we have some shots in my timeline. This is a combination of red files from one of our customers, Jeff Grossfeld. So thank you very much for letting us to use these files for this masterclass. Then we have another shots from Avri, which are basically the sample shots that they have in their website to test their cameras and to test their images. So I choose like a combination of these two raw formats, because one of the first problematic when we start a project in Mystica is what happened when we work with raw media, and specifically what happened when we work with mixed raw media or with mixed media in general. All right, because the best way, the first step when we work with raw media is loading, of course, the debugger for that media. So if we go to the effects, we have the debugger parameters in here for the red camera, Arri camera, Sony, Canon, Phantom, DNG, etc. Now the problem is, if we apply a wrong divider to the wrong media, for example, applying red params to the array, we will get something wrong, an image that is wrong. So we need to apply the right divider for the media. Just for starting from the basics, I'm just to select this shot. I'm going just to put it up so we can make a difference compared with the others, and I'm going just to play the red params over there. When we load the red params or the params for a divider for our raw media, basically Mystica loads by default or the source media from the camera, so the source metadata from the camera. That's the reason why when we open the divider, we see here source for Kelvin use, for tint, source, everything is the source. So it's basically the metadata from the camera. Specifically, if we go to the settings or from the new IPP2, we see all source for color space, gamma curve, ISO, etc. Which is more interesting in this specific masterclass is basically the gamma curve and the color space, because again we are going to talk about color management. Now, how can we see the right values of the camera in Mystica? The right way to do it is just once we have load our divider, we go to Edit, Macros, and in here we have an option that is called Load Row Params. So if we click it, a start appears on top of the effects, which means that this effect has been modified. So we can just go in here, open it, and now we see the value in there. So we have the Kelvin value, the Tim value, etc. If we go to the settings, again, because this is the most interesting part for this masterclass, we have the gamma curve, which was red gamma 4, and the color space, which was dragon color 2. If we go to APP2, we have all the parameters from the APP2 in there. So in that way, we can just load and see the metadata parameters, the default metadata from the camera for the camera in these divider effects. The image is not changing at all because again, even if you don't load the divider for this shot, Mystica automatically reads the metadata and loads the metadata from the camera there. So this is just a way to visualize that metadata in the right effect. Okay. So with this in mind, if we only have a project with red files, for example, we just need to take all of them, effects, red. Again, I'm leaving here the RV clips, so I'm going to focus only on the red ones. And then with all selected, I can just go to Edit, Macros, Load Row Params, and there you go. Now all the effects, all the divider params are loading the metadata from the camera. Now again, the problem of this workflow is what happens when we have mixed media, because we cannot apply a red param or a RV param to all my shots because I have mixed clips. Well, one trick is to using our browser to managing this kind of problem. The first thing, when we import the media in Mystica, basically we create links to that media. And it's pretty common to have organized that media in folders. So we have RV folder and red folder. If we go to the RV one, I can just select all my clips, go to Edit, and click in Find and Select. And that way, the RV clips will be selected in my timeline. So I can just put over there the RV params. And I can do the same thing with the red ones by just selecting all of them, Edit, Find and Select, and there you go. Now my red files has been selected, so I can just apply the red params over here. Now with all of them applied, I can just take all of my dividers to go to macro, load row params, and there you go. Now even the RV params and the red are loading the metadata information from the camera. As you can see, Mystica is clever enough to understand that here it has to load the metadata for RV, and in the red one has to load the metadata from red files. So in that particular case, you don't need to load different or to apply this macro twice, depending on the amount of mixed media that you have in your timeline. So as you can see, well, the managing of raw formats is fairly simple. This trick is pretty useful again when you have a mixed media in your timeline or in your conform file, because in that way you can find in a pretty easy way your clips in your timeline. So it's always recommended to have this feature in mind. Okay. Now when once we have load our divider, maybe we want to change something in the divider, change the color space and change the gamma curve, but for now I'm going to manage the color with our color management tool. So I'm going to ignore in this particular case and in this particular example the red files, and I'm going to focus only in the RV files. So I'm just going to move them here so we don't make the mistake of going to those shots. So for example in here, if we open the divider for in there, we go to the color space and we see that we have white gamut plus log C. So basically we have the color space and the gamma curve, both of them combined. This is quite different from what we have in red, because in red we have the gamma curve and the color space separated, but in RV both works together, which is the normal way to work. Now, if we want to manage or make any kind of color transformation over this shot, of course, because we're working with raw media, we can just transform it from here and select another profile. But in this particular case, I'm going to use the unicolor effect instead. So I'm going to load it and I'm going to open the unicolor. The unicolor is our main color management tool. is really simple. Basically, it has an input curve and an input gamut, and then an output gamut and an output curve, and the possibility of transforming the gamut or not. You can select if you want to transform the color space or not, or just make a gamma curve transformation. So, for example, in this particular case, we have a white gamut and log C. Well, we can transform this to Rec 709 by selecting my input curve is log C, my input gamut is white gamut. I want to transform the gamut, so I'm going to click in yes. And from here I can just select Rec 709, and from the output curve I can select gamma 2.4. There we go. Again, just as a reminder, basically we had as an output color space the white gamut and log C, and then from the unicolor we take it as an input and we deliver the output that we want. So basically this is a color transformation tool. We select the gamma curve, the color space, and we select the output gamma, the output gamma, color space and the output gamma curve. With this tool we can just make very complex workflows or very simple ones like this one, because at the end we're just transforming from log C to Rec 709. No? All right, so the thing is, what if I want to apply this? How can I apply, for example, these settings to the rest of my timeline or to the shots that I have in my timeline, etc. Because as you can see, the unicolor here is working in one shot. Now, here comes a really important thing, a really important element in Mistika. Mistika's timelines is agnostic. It doesn't have a proper color space or a proper gamma curve applied, and for that reason I can combine any amount of color spaces and any amount of gamma curves in the timeline. For example, this shot right now is in Rec 709 thanks to the unicolor tool, but this shot is still in log C, in white gamut log C, and this shot, the red one, is in red gamma 4 and dragon color 2. So at the end, basically what I have is an infinite space where I can just put any amount of clips with any amount of color spaces and gamma curves without changing the behavior of the timeline. So basically we're managing the color of my projects shot by shot, but of course this is not the only way to work. What happens if we have, for example, this particular case with 3 shots, but this can be extrapolated to any amount of shots. Let's say that we want to extend or to propagate these settings that transform from log C to Rec 709 to the rest of my timeline or of my project. Well, in that particular case, I'm going to repeat the process. So I'm going to select all my clips, go to effects, and insert a unicolor effect. There we go. Now we don't need to work in all my shots or going shot by shot. We can just use one as a reference and then propagate this unicolor to the rest of my timeline. So basically, if I do the same thing, which basically was to select log C and white gamut, I can transform this to, again, Rec 709 and gamma 2.4, right? So now from here, I can just take all those parameters, go to propagate, and click in all objects. We have several options here. We can work by gangs, we can work by current layer, which will affect only the unicolors that are in this layer, in this track in my timeline, or we can just use the selected ones. In this particular case, I'm just going to propagate to all my unicolors because at the end we only have unicolors in the array file, so that's fine. It's a quicker way because at the end it will affect all the unicolor effects in my timeline. So I'm going to click in perform propagate. Here I get a warning message telling me that this feature is going to overwrite all the original parameters of the unicolors. So I'm going to click OK because it's what I want. And then all my unicolors have the same settings, as you can see. So this is a very quick way to propagate as color settings to the rest of my shots or to my timeline. Another way to do it is using another macro. So basically, if we take the unicolor in here and extend it, this will take all my shots. Now, for navigation reasons, I always recommend to split this kind of general effects that takes a full timeline into shots. Is not mandatory, and there are many situations where having these effects, like having the effects in this way, is pretty useful. But in this particular case, because, well, first because we only have 3 shots, and because we are just applying one effect on top of it, I can just take the full stacks, go to macro, and click in a split conform. And in that way, Mystica will cut all the shots, all the effects in shots. So it's another quick way to subdivide an effect. Of course, this option is still available. So for example, if we want to just put something as a general adjustment for all my shots, normally this will be on top of my stack, because normally will be affect the output or something like that. Basically, we can just increase the scope and just put it in there. I always recommend just to increase the scope and leave some space in here, just in case we want to put more effects in my timeline without affecting the full structure of my stack. So again, 3 ways to do the same thing, because at the end, this effects is affecting in the same way than the splitted effect my timeline. So at the end, the behavior is the same, the result is the same. The only difference is how we manage that unicolor. Okay, so with this in mind, we can just try to understand where to place the color grade in this kind of stacks, because as you can see, when I just put this up and put some effects in here, you have seen that I put the color grade over there, and then we have the unicolor here. So where we should put the unicolor, or sorry, where we should put the color grade in my timeline? Well, to be fair, this depends, of course, of the workflow, and it depends, of course, of the project. For example, in this particular case, just to stay in the basics, I'm going to just use one shot as an example. I want to make my SDR version, a Rec 709 version of this shot, and in here I want to make the color grade. Where should I apply the color grade? Well, in this particular case, I will apply it in here below the transformation to Rec 709. Basically, because we want, or I prefer, and I think you will be agreed with me, that it's much better to grade in Loxy and White Gamut than doing it in Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4, where you are basically limiting a little bit of your signal. Mystica, the color range in Mystica is never lost, so you always keep it. But even though it's much better to work with this unicolor on top of your stack, because at the end, this is like your output. This is like your output effect for your grading. So basically, we have our RV params in Loxy and White Gamut. Then we grade over that color settings, and we finally output to Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4. The way to work in that way is by using the eval tree. As you can see, we have 2 selectors. One is in blue, the other one is in green. This is a pretty basic stuff in Mystica, but just to refresh a little bit how this works. Basically, the blue one controls your output, and your green one controls the parameters, the effect. So yeah, it controls the effects that you want to change. So in this case, we're keeping the output in the last unicolor, and we are just transforming and selecting the effect that we want to change. So for example, here the color grade, and then we can just make our contrast, increase saturation, etc., etc. All right. So basically, this is the way to work when we have this pretty basic workflow. We want to grade in Loxy, and we want to output to Rec 709. Now this can change when we work in more complex examples. So let's take a look to this. I'm going to remove this. And in this particular case, I'm going to show you a more complex example by creating a workflow for DCPs, for creating a movie or any kind of content that is going to be projected in a theater. So basically, in this workflow, we have here the wide gamut plus log-C. Normally, when we grade something for the DCP, we work in P3 and gamma 2.6, so we can just select it directly from here. Just to offer you another option, just because let's say that you want to keep the camera settings by default in your debugger, I'm going to keep the wide gamut plus log-C, and instead of make the transformation directly here, which is probably the fastest way to do it, I'm going to use a unicolor. So I go to the unicolor effect, and in here I'm going to make a transformation from log-C and DCP and P3, sorry, and then I'm going to transform, oh sorry, no, this is wide gamut, and then I'm going to transform to P3 and gamma 2.6. There you go. So basically we are transforming from wide gamut plus log-C to P3 and gamma 2.6, which are the basic settings for grading for theater and for creating DCPs. So basically I'm going to add a color grade over here, and then I can just grade in there. As you can see, in this particular case, I'm grading over the unicolor because P3 is limiting my signal much less than Rec 709. But you can as well work in this way. Both of them are perfectly correct. So because at the end, what is important is to know that at the end, your output is P3 and gamma 2.6. The color grade doesn't transform your output. So if the latest color transformation is in here and then you apply multiple color grades, that doesn't matter because your output is still the latest unicolor, the latest effect that transform the color space and your gamma curve. So for that reason, is not really important from the technical point of view, not for the grading part, but for the technical point of view, if the unicolor is in here or is in top. I guess that many of you will prefer to work in this way with a color grade in the middle and your P3 gamma 2.6 on top, but both are correct. Now, what happened when we create a DCP? Well, this is not the last color transformation that we have to do. At the end, we need to make another color transformation, which is to transform from P3 and gamma 2.6 to XYZ, which is the standard color space for DCP. So in that situation, we can just apply another unicolor, and this unicolor I can transform from gamma 2.6 and P3 to XYZ, and DCDN gamma 2.6, which is basically the right gamma curve for DCPs. You can see in here that the system is telling you that this is the proper gamma curve for XYZ. So I select it, and there you go. This is the image that we will render to J2K to then pack those J2K in an MXF in the DCP module. So this is an example of how we work with more than one unicolor in our timeline. Basically, we have one unicolor from our grading output in this particular case, and then one standard transformation for rendering to J2K for the DCP. Again, and this is important, at the end your output is as well controlled by your monitor. So even if you are working in this case, so basically we have this P3 color space and the gamma 2.6 selected. If in our external monitor, if in our reference monitor we have another settings, at the end we are making the grading for those settings. So the last element in the chain is basically your monitor. So this is really important because at the end it's much better to match the output from Mystica to the settings in the monitor than trying to have something different between them, because at the end you will get not visually probably is not wrong, but technically it can be wrong, the fact that you have in here in your timeline you're making your grading for P3 and gamma 2.6, but at the end you are by correcting with your eye using basically the color grade node the latest transformation, which is a transformation to Rec 709, because you have, for example, your monitor in Rec 709. So keep in mind that Mystica, in this particular case, controls most of the transformations, but the last one is always done for your reference monitor. If your reference monitor have the same settings than Mystica, then you are in a very safe environment in the way that everything is controlled by Mystica. But if your monitor have different settings, then you have to take care of that, because maybe the result is not what you expect. So be careful with that. But again, as you can see, this is an example of how we merge, or how we compare, or how we mix two unicolors. In this particular case, we have three elements that control the color space. The first one is the divider, which is with the white gamut plus log C, and the other one is the unicolor for transforming from log C and white gamut to P3 and gamma 2.6, and the last one is transforming to XYZ and DCDM gamma 2.6. Basically, this is a chain of changes. Basically, this output will be the input of this unicolor, and the output of this unicolor will be the input of the last unicolor. It works always in that way, in that direction. I know that there are some advanced operators that breaks this kind of rules because they found it more useful for their grading, because they prefer to grade in other color spaces and cheat a little bit with Mystica, using weird settings, combining color spaces and gamma curves that normally don't work together, etc. I'm not going to enter in this kind of workflows because, well, again, as I said at the beginning, if they work, they work. You don't need to worry about it. But in this particular case, I will focus on more standard workflows to at least give you a full overview of how Mystica manages color in the timeline. All right, so with this philosophy in mind, we can work with ACEs, because at the end, when we work with ACEs, we are doing something similar to what we are doing in here. Basically, we have an input color space, we have our grading over that color space, and we have an output. The structure is normally the same independently of the project. So let's go and let's cover the ACEs workflow. I'm going to use this shot just to change and to offer another kind of file. In this particular case, the red one. So in here, we're going to change the divider parameters. I'm going to go inside and just go to my settings. And in there, in the settings folder, I have the bit depth, where I can find the 16 bits ACEs. This setting change depending of the raw media. So if we go to the ARRI ones, we will see that it's in color space and we have ACEs there. If we click it, it will transform to ACEs and linear, because basically is the IDT for the camera is the ACEs color space and the AP0 in this case, and the linear gamma curve, which is the standard when we work with ACEs. So I'm going to do the same thing here, this shot, by selecting ACEs 16 bits. There you go. As you can see, it's changing automatically to linear, because again, this is the standard for ACEs. Okay, so how can we work with this kind of files? Right, so now we have to select, once we have this setting applied in the divider, we have to select in which color space and in which gamma curve we want to work. This is more, it's up to the colorists, it's up to you guys. In this particular case, you can use the gamma curve and the color space that you want, because at the end, we will apply an output transformation using the ACEs ODT. In this workflow, in this example that I'm showing here, I'm going to focus on the standard protocol, or the most standard way to work, by using a unicolor. And in this unicolor, I'm going to select the input curve linear, the input gamut AP0, which is the ACEs linear. I'm going to transform the gamut. I'm going to go to output gamut and select AP1, which is the color space for ACEs CCT, which is the gamma curve that I'm going to use in this particular case for my grading. So AP1, this is CCT, and here ACES CCT, which again is the color correction, color transformation gamma curve that I'm going to use for my grading. So I select it. There you go. And now over here, I'm going to apply my color grade, because again, this is the transformation that I've created for my grading. Again, these settings can be overruled and use other settings, like for example, Alexa with Gamut and LogC, or Sony if you prefer with S3, etc. You can use all the other settings here, because at the end you will apply final transformation with ACES ODT. But if you are working in an ACES workflow, it makes sense to use the whole time ACES parameters. So we go to my color grade, and over my color grade, I'm going to apply the ACES ODT, which is basically the output display transformation. So I'm going to select it. And in here, this is like a unicolor, but focused on the ACES parameter or the ACES settings. So in here, I'm going to select the ACES CCT, which again was my output from the unicolor. The gamut is going to be AP1, which again was my output from my unicolor. And then finally here we have a list of settings proposed by ACES, which basically contains like several color spaces and gamma curve. For example, here is P3, in the 60, the 65, we have Rec 709, Rec 2020, and of course we have the HDR gamma curve that we will see later. The great thing of the ACES ODT is that, for example, here for HDR, it basically have information about the needs of our monitor, so we can make the transformation in a much more accurate way. But in this particular case, just to show how this works, I'm going to select Rec 709, because at the end, I guess that most of you will see this masterclass in a normal monitor. So I'm going to select Rec 709 to see the transformation in the best possible way. Right, so this is the final transformation, and as you can see, as we did with the previous unicolors, we have the ACES ODT on top. So basically, we keep the ACES ODT here on top, and then we work in the color grade. All right, then later we can just export everything together. So this is an example of how ACES workflow works. Basically, it's pretty similar to what we have in here with the DCP or what we did with the Rec 709. In this particular case, the main difference is the fact that we are using a unicolor to transform to the ACES color space and gamma curve for the grading, and we're using a specific effect. Instead of a unicolor, we're using a specific effect for the final transformation for our output. This basically is the setting that has to match the settings that we have in the monitor. The same thing that we have in our DCP example with to remove the XYZ setting. In here we have the P3 and gamma 2.6, which those are the settings that we need to have as well in our monitor to get the most accurate result. In here we should have the selected preset here in ACES ODT. Alright, now when we talk about ACES, we normally talk about HDR, SDR, etc. etc. HDR normally is not more complicated than working with SDR projects, but when we work in an HDR project, normally we need to deliver two versions. One is in HDR, the second one is the SDR version. It's pretty uncommon to only have one specific version, like only HDR or only SDR in this case. So we're going to show how can we manage for the same project, for the same clips, for the same amount of clips, how can we manage the HDR version and the SDR version at the same time, right? I'm going to start with the most obvious way to do it. I'm going to remove the array files. I don't need them for this explanation, so I'm going to focus only in the red files. I'm going to deliver all those transformations that I did in here. You will see that I'm going to replicate them again, but well, it works as a reminder of how we did it. So let's start from the scratch. And here I'm going just to go to 16 bits just to recover a previous situation. Okay, good. All right, so we have this this timeline, and we need to make our color management workflow. Well, the first thing when we have to do an HDR project or an SDR project is to think about which is going to be the main version for that project. There are many colors that prefer to work in the SDR version and then go to the HDR version because they know that it's much more probable that more people will see the project in a normal SDR monitor. And so there are other colors that prefer to spend their time or most of their time in the best version, which at the end, for technical reasons, will be probably the HDR version, and then make some adjustment to create the SDR version. In this particular case, I'm going to use this last example, so I'm going to start with the HDR version and then move to the SDR. But again, as I said at the beginning, this masterclass is not to tell you how you should work. It's just to offering you different examples and different workflows of how we can manage the color in Mystica. Again, if you prefer to work in HDR at the beginning and then move to the HDR version, that's totally fine. It's just another option. All right. So in this particular case, I'm going to manage my HDR workflow using ACES again. Because well, at the end, it's a standard. Is being used by most of the biggest companies right now in the market. Netflix, for example, is defending the use of ACES in the workflows in their workflow. So at the end, because it's becoming a standard, I think it's important to work with it and see different examples of how to work with ACES. So in this particular case, the first thing I'm going to do is to again go to my bit depth in my divider file, the divider effect, sorry, and select 16 ACES. And with this bit depth selected, I'm going just to propagate this setting, only this setting. Be careful, do not select the full settings or the full folder because you will propagate all of it, and we only need to propagate the bit depth. So select the bit depth with all objects active and just perform propagate. Well, I say all objects because I know that in my timeline right now we only have red files, but if you have mixed media, do what we did at the beginning. Using your media, you can just select your files by format and then apply the red params and make the propagate by selected or the current layer if you have it. You have your files in different layers, etc. In this particular case, I'm just going to use all objects. So perform propagate. Okay, and now I'm going to enable my storyboard. There we go. Now all my files are in linear and ACES color space. Well, except this file, of course, because this is not red. This is a normal TIFF. So basically all my red files now have this parameter. Now we go to all of them, and I'm going to load a unicolor effect. There we go. With this unicolor, I'm going to transform from linear and AP0 like we did before. I'm going to transform the color space and select AP1, which is the color space for ACES CCT, remember? And finally ACES CCT to make our grading. Okay, that's good. And now I'm going to propagate this setting to the rest of my unicolors. So basically I'm going to take all this. In this particular case, I'm going to take all the settings because I want to propagate everything. Perform propagate. Okay. And now all my clips have this setting applied, as you can see in here. Great. Now is the moment to load my SDR. My color grade effect. The SDR version, we will do it later. Alright, so I have my color grade effect on top of my unicolor. And without going to the color grade, I'm going to select my ACES ODT in here. Now, because I want to rename it, just to keep things more simple, I'm going to just, instead of loading an ACES ODT over all my shots, I'm going to load over one of them, so ACES ODT. I'm going to go to my edit, attributes, ACES ODT, HDR, just to give more information in my timeline and keep things in a more clear way. just extend this clip, take everything, edit, macro, split conform. As you can see, we are using basically the same tools over and over again in this particular case to an HDR workflow, but this can be used as well for any kind of workflow. In this ACES file, I'm going to select ACES CCT as my input curve, which was the output from a unicolor, the AP1 color space, which again was the output of my unicolor, and then in here I'm going to select the gamma curve that I want to use for my HDR workflow. Let's say that we want to use the Rec 2020 4000 nits PQ because we're working, for example, with the Dolby Pulsar monitor. So we select it. There you go. And I'm going to propagate these settings over the rest of my ACES ODT files. So all objects, perform, okay, and now all my clips have the same settings. So basically, I've just prepared my timeline to start my grading. As you can see, I've never started grading until I have my color management done. This is really important because at the end, if your color workflow is pretty clear and is working fine, then you basically start with the technical part, and then you go to the artistic or the more artistic part without any kind of issues or technical issues in the future. So that's the reason why I normally recommend to build your timeline first, and then start with the creative stuff. In this particular case, our timeline is built from the color management perspective. We probably need a framing just to scale the files to the project resolution, which is HD. But other than that, the color management is already done. So now we can start in here to make our grading. Okay. For obvious reasons, because we're working in Rec 2020 and 4000 nits, any adjustment that I can do in here won't make any sense from a visual point of view. So I'm not going to spend any time here in the color grade, but basically the color grade is taking the signal that comes from the unicolor, and at the end we have the transformation with the ACES ODT effect. Great, now this is my HDR version. So how we manage the SDR version? Well, again, at the beginning I said I'm going to start with the most obvious way to do it, which is basically by duplicating my project or by duplicating my timeline. I can just take all my files, duplicate them, and just put them in here. Now, instead of using this ACES ODT HDR, which is configured in Rec 2020 and 4000 nits, I'm going to use another ACES ODT, which is one for Rec 709, for example. But before doing this, remember that we use this version of my project as my master project because I wanted to spend more time in the HDR version, because at the end I can just get more details and I can make more stuff than the things that I can do in a normal SDR project. So this color grade over here at the end is working like my master grading. Even if this master grading has been created to Rec 2020 and 4000 nits, at the end is useful for the SDR version. So instead of removing this grading, what we are going to apply is another layer of color grades. Just to keep it simple again, what I'm going to do is going to load a color grade in here, and I'm going just to rename it and call it grade SDR. All right, so this is going to be our adjustment for my SDR version. So what I can do is just take this again, extend it, take it, macro, and split conform. So basically we have my master grading, which was created for my HDR version, my adjustment for the SDR version, and then the last one is the ACES ODT, which I'm going to call it ACES ODT SDR. So in that way, in that way, I have just prepared my timeline for the SDR version as well. There you go. So now basically we have the two versions. We have the HDR version and the SDR version. Now, one thing that you will probably ask is, well, okay, that's good. Timeline is flexible, that's obvious, but how we can just move from here to here if we make any adjustment in my master version and I want to bring that adjustment in my SDR version? Well, we can use the match and paste functionality, but we need to be careful with one thing. If we take all this project here and select copy, then we go to here and select match and paste and try to match by timecode, by real name, etc., by everything, this will replace all the effects in my stack. So if I click and paste, you see that basically we have just removed all the settings and all the adjustments that we did for my SDR version. We are basically duplicating this project over here, which is not what we want, because we want to keep my SDR version there. So how can we move this? How can we change that? All right, so there is a pretty cool way to do it, which is basically by first locking this, because at the end, this ACES ODT effect, we don't want to bring it to my SDR version, and we don't want to replace my SDR settings, my great SDR and my ACES ODT SDR. So I'm going to lock them as well. So in that way, I'm sure that those are not being replaced when I copy from here to there. So basically, I'm just leaving this area here for modifying. Basically, the area that controls my master grading and all the previous color transformations that we did to adapt my project to ACES AP1 and ACES CCT. This part is the one that I want to replace if I make any change in here. I want to propagate the change to the SDR version. So from here, let's, for example, do a quick adjustment. It's just something pretty obvious, so we can see it directly in the other version. I can just take this, copy, take my second version, match and paste, and paste. And as you can see, the shot that we change in there has now the same adjustment. But the good thing is we haven't replaced the SDR area or the SDR settings for my project. So basically we're keeping both of them and just copy from one to the other. So it's a very quick workflow if you want to keep by separate the two versions. All right. So now let's go to a more advanced option. So I'm going to duplicate this project over here and put it in there. All right, so this is cool because, well, it's an example of how we can just move settings from one project to another. So that's really cool. But what happens if we want to compare two versions, the HDR and the SDR version at the same time, which is something that is a very powerful feature of Mistika. In this particular case, we need to build our timeline like we have done in here. But basically what we are going to is to combine this version with this version over here. To make it faster, I'm going just to do it again, all the output parts. So this works as a reminder again and as an example of how this works. I'm going to make this smaller timeline to have more effects in here in a more cleaner way. So basically we have this unicolor. Remember that we have it in AP1 and ACES CCT. And over this unicolor, I'm going to apply my color grading node, right? But instead of just load a color grid, I'm going to make it easier by rename it and calling master grading, right? And I'm going to now insert another color grid, which is going to be called SDR grading. And now I need two ACES ODT because one is for my HDR version. I'm going to call it ODT HDR, and the other one is going to call it HDR SDR. There you go. So now basically what we are doing is exactly what we did in here by combining my HDR version with the SDR version in just one stack. So basically we have our master grading, which is the one that we are going to use for my HDR version, my SDR grading, which is the adjustment that I'm going to apply over my master grading for transform the HDR version to the SDR, and then the two outputs, one HDR and the other one is SDR. All right, so I'm going to configure my outputs like we did in the previous example by selecting ACCCT, AP1, and Rec 2020, 4000 nits, and PQ. All right, now in the SDR version, I'm going to select ACCCT, AP1, but instead of Rec 2020 and 4000 nits, I'm going to select Rec 709. Now, the problem is that now we are just connecting the HDR output or the HDR transformation to the SDR transformation, which doesn't make any sense, and it will create a lot of complex, a lot of mistakes in the final result. So basically what we need to do is to bypass the signal. So imagine that we have two monitors in this situation, right? There are some video boards that support stereo signal. And using the stereo signal, we can just split the signal in left eye and right eye. And then we can just send one of those effects to the left signal, which is, let's say that the left signal is our HDR monitor. In fact, just to make it clear, I'm going to create here a note calling HDR. I'm going to move it in there, and another note, call it SDR. So we have HDR and SDR. So we have the left monitor is HDR, the right monitor is SDR. So how can we send some of those effects, so no, those signals to the HDR version, and how we can just send those to the SDR version? Well, it's pretty simple. If we go to here, we have bypass left and bypass right. For example, the SDR grading, we don't want to see it in the HDR monitor, obviously. What we want to see it is only in the SDR. So basically I'm going to bypass left. So in this way, it won't, Mystica won't send this signal to the HDR monitor. Now with the HDR version, I don't want to see this transformation in the SDR monitor. So what I'm going to do is just to bypass right. So in that way, I'm just moving this signal to the HDR monitor. And with the SDR monitor, I'm going to do the same thing with my SDR grading. Just bypass left, because again, this output is only for the SDR monitor. So basically in that way, we have SDR grading for SDR monitor, HDR output from my HDR monitor, and my SDR output from my SDR monitor. Everything in one stack, and everything can be played at the same time, which is pretty cool. Now, Mystica doesn't have any kind of limitation in resolution or frame rate or anything in this. There are other systems that are limited when you work in that way. In Mystica, the limitation is the hardware. If the hardware doesn't support more than HD when you have your signal split in two, then is what you will get. If your video board support two signals in two streams in 4K, then you will get 4K. So it's pretty flexible, because at the end it's only limited by the hardware and not by the software. Now, how can we just propagate this to the rest of my timeline? Pretty simple. Sorry, I'm just going to move everything here, extend it, and just macro split conform. And there we go. Now we have my timeline fully prepared to work at the same time with SDR and HDR, and grade both of them at the same time, and see both of them at the same time. If for any reason we don't want to see one specific version, we can always just mute a version, and there we go. It's another way to do it. As you can see, Mystica saved the last step. If we reveal it again, we have all the bypass there. So it's really simple. It's really flexible, the way that we can just work with our projects in HDR and SDR at the same time. As you can see, and this is like going back to the beginning, because Mystica's timeline is agnostic, we have now like two workflows, two different ways to do the same thing at the end. In this particular case, we can see the two versions at the same time, but at the end we're just working in the same way. We have my HDR version as the master one and the SDR version as my secondary version of the same project. Now there is another way to manage this kind of workflows between HDR and SDR by using Dolby Vision. So let's take a look how to use Dolby Vision in Mystica. I'm going to duplicate my master version, which is the HDR version. And just as a reminder, we had as an output Rec 2020, 4000 nits, and PQ. And this setting is important because it's the one that we're going to have in our master display. And have my grading here, just remove it. All right. One important thing before working with Dolby Vision, we need to be careful, and you see this rescale message in there. We need to transform and to adapt my project to the my media to the project resolution. So what I'm going to do first is just going to here, framing, and just clicking project and crop to fit, for example. I'm going to propagate those settings to the rest of the framings, and there we go. Now all my shots are adapted to the project. Right, so I'm going to work with this particular shot for showing Dolby Vision. Okay, so again, we're working in Rec 2020 and 4000 nits, right? Okay, and of course PQ. So what we have to do first is to load my Dolby Vision effect on top of it. Of course, you need a license provided by Dolby. The license is not related with Mystica, so if you don't have a license in your system, Dolby allows to load the Dolby Vision effect and to make the analysis, but you won't be able to control the trims or of your media. So at the end, you will need a proper license for that. All right, so what I'm going to do is to go first to my setup, Dolby Manager, and in here we have several options. The first one is the aspect ratio. By default, it's taking the source. This is basically related with the letterbox of my clips. In this particular case, I don't have any letterboxes, but if I have letterbox, I need to put in here the aspect ratio of those letterbox. This works in a global way, but per shot, you have this shot parameter to select in this specific shot another aspect ratio. I'm going to leave it just in global. Now, if we go back again to the Dolby Manager, here I have the CMU version, the kind of CMU. We have internal and external. I'm going to select the internal one, of course, because I don't have any external CMU connected to the system. Here is the version of Dolby Vision that we are using, which is the 2.9 version. And here it comes the most important part of my settings, which is the master display that I'm using for my grading, which again in this particular case was 4000 nits, 2020 and PQ, so we leave it in that way. But as you can see, we have a list of settings provided by Dolby, and we need to select one of those settings from this list. So again, this is the 4000 nits, 2020 and PQ color space and color settings. And in here we select the target display, which is, again, is another list with some settings that we need to select the one that we want to use for converting our signals from 4000 nits, 2020 and PQ to the one that we select in here. Again, in this particular case, just to keep things simple, I'm just going to select the 100 nits Rec 709. Clicking accept, and I'm going to use only one shot as an example. But if we go to here, go to 0 and click in perform, this will change the image to this kind of greenish or yellowish image. This is like an indicator of this shot is going to be analyzed. Now if we press play, Mystica is analyzing the shot. The speed of the analysis depends on the speed of the play. So basically, if your shots plays in real time, you will get a much faster analysis. You don't need to go shot by shot, okay? So you can just propagate this setting and then play the whole timeline, and Mystica will analyze the whole timeline. But in this particular case, I'm going just to focus on one shot. And as you can see, once the analysis is finished, we have the minimum peak, maximum, and the average. And if we bypass this, you can see the color transformation that the Dolby Vision effect is doing over my image. Now, in here we have the trims. The trim basically controls the target transformation that we are doing and the way that we can change that the result using the leaf, gamma gain parameters, the chroma weight, and the saturation gain. We can have multiple trims if we have multiple deliveries. So for example, let's say that we have another trim for 600 nits and 2020 and PQ. Well, we can just enable another trim with those settings, and now we have two trims. So when we export this media, we will export metadata for the 100 nits version and the 600 nit version. Be careful because you cannot have duplicated trims in one Dolby Vision effect. If this is the case, Mystica will give you a warning message telling you that there is a problem, and the problem is that you have duplicated trims in one Dolby Vision effects. Don't worry, because if this happens, for example, I'm going just to select all of it and just export the metadata. Dolby export. You see that some instances are duplicated trims, so basically is selecting you where you have your trims are duplicated. So this is the warning message that you get, so be careful, you cannot have duplicated trims for any of those trims, right? Now, what can you do with the trim? But again, it's just manipulating the color image, the color aspects of the image to make it look as close as possible to your master result. So basically you have the leaf gamma gain in here to control the color image. All right. So this is a way to control the final result of your SDR version in this case, because again we are just transforming from 4000 nits 2020 MPQ to 100 nits and Rec 709. Now, once we have this, we need to export the media. So we have two ways. You have seen one of them, which is basically by selecting the area or the shots or the project that we want to export, go to macros and Dolby export. And this will export only the metadata for these particular shots or for the selected shots. If you want to render the result and get the metadata, both things together, you need to select, well, the shot or the amount of shots that you want, go to the output, and in here in the video part, you can just select Dolby HDR and select, well, by default is the Dolby Mezzanine, there is no other option, and just render this. And this is the version for Dolby, which again renders the image with the transformation and exports the metadata automatically. Okay, so as you can see, the workflow with Dolby Vision is really simple. One thing that we need to keep in mind is that Dolby Vision needs to be on top always. There is only one case where the Dolby Vision is below one effect in Mystica, which is when we use dissolves. If we want to go to here and apply a dissolve, the dissolve must be on top. What Mystica is doing here is taking the metadata from this Dolby Vision effect and is interpolating this metadata with the next one. So basically, when you export this, you will have a result with the metadata interpolated between both shots. But this is the only example where the Dolby Vision is below an effect on Mystica. The rest, for the rest of the effects, for the rest of the workflows, Dolby Vision must be on top of everything. All right. So we have seen how to manage an HDR and SDR workflow. The last thing that I want to show you guys is the use of display filters for managing some of these examples. So basically, for example, again, to duplicating this HDR master workflow, if we only have one version, or even if we have several versions, but I think it works much better with just one version. This output that we have in here is the same one in all the shots, so it doesn't make any sense to have it in the timeline, just in case, except if you want to have it in here, like in this example where we are combining HDR with SDR. If it's just an output transformation for my timeline, there is a much more elegant way to work with it, which is using display filters. So basically what we can do is just duplicate the effect that we want to use as a display filter, duplicate one media because any display filter needs a media. So duplicate it because it will remove the stack when we create it, the display filter. Then go to the display filter menus, and in here I'm going to create a display filter by calling it ASYS ODT. I have to put underscores just in case. ODT HDR. Okay. So now, as you can see, the stack has disappeared, but now I can just go to my grading here and select display filter, and we have several options here. I'm going to select ASYS ODT HDR. Then I can apply this transformation to the GUI, to the live, to the scope, to the render, or you can just enable it and disable where you want to apply this display filter. The great thing of the display filters is that those effects are invisible. They are always applied on top of it, and for those effects that are the same effect for the whole project, they are really, really useful, because at the end, I mean, you don't need to change this effect at any moment. So at the end, you want to keep your timeline as clean as possible. So thanks to that, for example, we are just removing one effect in here. And we can do the same thing with the SDR version, for example, and having an ASYS ODT for HDR and another one for SDR, and just enable or disable them using the display filters. Right, so with this final example, it finished this masterclass. I hope you like it. As you can see, the color management in Mystica, like everything in Mystica, is really, really flexible. You can work with it in the way that you want, thanks to the timeline, and thanks to the fact that it's agnostic, and you can just duplicate, manipulate, copy, paste, etc. between projects. It's really flexible, but I understand that it requires a little bit of time to get used to it, because it's a bit different with other systems. Again, I hope you enjoyed this presentation, this masterclass, and now is, I guess, the moment of questions. So go ahead.